Susan Sontag, The Third World of Women. Author's note, the following text was written in July 1972 in response to a questionnaire sent to me and 5 other women, including Simone de Beauvoir and the Italian Communist deputy Rosanna Rosanda, by the editors of Libre, a new Spanish-language political and literary quarterly with a loosely Marxist orientation, edited in Paris. It was published in the October 1972 issue of Libre, number 3, in a translation by the Spanish novelist Juan Goytisolo. Most of the readers of Libre live in Latin America, which explains the painstakingly explicit character of what I wrote. The nature of the magazine's readership explains as well my freedom to assume, when writing my answers, that a revolutionary socialist view of the subject is, at the very least, something to contend with. In the United States, where militant feminism is a livelier and much more widely heard point of view right now than it is anywhere else, discussion tends to be less and less explicit about the root questions and rarely even alludes to the Marxist analysis. Nevertheless, because the formulation of a political perspective is still everywhere in its early stages, that seems to me to justify printing here what I wrote for a quite different audience. A few paragraphs first, a sort of prologue, a response to a more general question which you don't ask. At what stage now is the struggle for women's liberation? For thousands of years, practically everyone in the world assumed that it lay in the nature of the human species that some people were superior and should be masters, and other people were inferior and should be slaves. Only about 150 years ago did elements of the ruling classes begin to suspect that slavery was not really, after all, natural, and that the undeniably servile and culturally underdeveloped character of slaves could be explained by the very fact that these people were slaves, were brought up to be slaves, instead of proving that they deserved to be slaves. Support for the emancipation of women stands today approximately where support for the emancipation of slaves stood 2 centuries ago. Just as throughout the millennia of unquestioning acceptance of slavery, the age-old oppression of women is justified by an appeal to presumed inequalities natural to the species. Let me reread that. Just as throughout the millennia of unquestioning acceptance of slavery, the age-old oppression of women is justified by an appeal to presumed inequalities natural to the species. The vast majority of people on this planet, women as well as men, remain convinced that women have a different nature than men, and that these natural differences make women inferior. Educated people in urbanized countries, especially those who regard themselves as liberals or socialists, often deny they believe these differences make women inferior. That women differ from men, they argue, does not mean that women are not the equal of men. Their argument is as dishonest as the separate but equal argument once used to defend the legal segregation of the races in schools. For the specific content of these supposedly innate differences between women and men imply a scale of values in which the qualities assigned to women are clearly less estimable than those assigned to men. Masculinity is identified with competence, autonomy, self-control, ambition, risk-taking, independence, rationality. Femininity is identified with incompetence, helplessness, irrationality, passivity, non-competitiveness, being nice. Women are trained for second-class adulthood, most of what is cherished as typically feminine behavior being simply behavior that is childish, servile, weak, immature. No wonder men balk at accepting women as their full equals. Vive la différence, indeed. Not expecting women to be truthful or punctual or expert in handling and repairing machines or frugal or muscular or physically brave makes all women who are exceptional. Every generation produces a few women of genius, or at least of irrepressible eccentricity. who win special status for themselves, but the historical visibility of the Trung sisters, Joan of Arc, St. Teresa, Mademoiselle Maupin, George Eliot, Louis Michel, Harriet Tubman, Isabel Eberhardt, Marie Curie, Rosa Luxemburg, Amelia Earhart, and the other of that small band is understood to follow precisely from their possessing qualities that women do not normally have. Such women are credited with masculine energy, intelligence, willfulness, and courage. Examples of unusually capable and genuinely independent women do not shake the general presumption of women's inferiority, any more than the discovery and favored treatment of intellectually talented slaves made cultivated Roman slave owners doubt the naturalness of slavery. The argument from nature is self-confirming. Individual lives which do not confirm the argument will always be taken as exceptions, thereby leaving the stereotypes intact. Historically, or rather prehistorically, the oppression of women must have arisen out of certain practical arrangements to ensure their special biological responsibility, childbearing. The elaborate forms of women's oppression, psychological, political, economic, cultural, all refer back to the biological division of labor. But the fact that women bear children while men do not hardly proves that women and men are fundamentally different. It rather indicates how slim is the basis in nature for the supposed difference, whereby women's reproductive physiology is converted into a life vocation with its appropriately narrow norms of character and temperament. But even physiological nature is not an immutable fact with unchanging consequences. It too is part of history and evolves with history. If the whole difference between women and men ultimately rests on the fact that women are busy bearing children, then the circumstances in which that vocation is exercised have been severely modified. If nature has supplied the pretext for women's enslavement, then history now supplies the objective conditions for their social and psychological liberation. For it is just this importance of the physiological difference between women and men which is becoming obsolete. I'm going to read that whole paragraph again. Historically, or rather prehistorically, the oppression of women must have arisen out of certain practical arrangements to ensure their special biological responsibility, childbearing. The elaborate forms of women's oppression, psychological, political, economic, cultural, all refer back to the biological division of labor. But the fact that women bear children while men do not hardly proves that women and men are fundamentally different. It rather indicates how slim is the basis in nature for the supposed difference, whereby women's reproductive physiology is converted into a life vocation, with its appropriately narrow norms of character and temperament. But even physiological nature is not an immutable fact with unchanging consequences. It, too, is part of history and evolves with history. If the whole difference between women and men ultimately rests on the fact that women are busy bearing children, then the circumstances in which that vocation is exercised have been severely modified. If nature has supplied the pretext for women's enslavement, then history now supplies the objective conditions for their social and psychological liberation. For it is just this importance of the physiological difference between women and men which is becoming obsolete. Knew that wasn't going to stand out. The Industrial Revolution provided the material base for a reconsideration of slavery. When machines were invented that were more productive and efficient than unpaid labor, it became reasonable to free people from legal bondage to work. Now the ecological turning point, increased longevity plus the population explosion plus the rapid depletion of natural resources, makes it not only possible but ultimately imperative that most women be freed from all but the most minimal relation to their biological responsibility. Once the reproductive destiny of women shrinks to 2, 1, or no pregnancies, with every likelihood that, for the first time in history, almost all children born will live to adulthood, the underlying rationale for the repressive definition of women as servile, domestic, primarily child-rearing creatures collapses. As the Industrial Revolution encouraged people to rethink the naturalness of slavery, so the new ecological era which the planet entered in the middle of the 20th century is enabling people to rethink the hitherto self-evident femininity of women. The femininity of women and the masculinity of men are morally defective and historically obsolete conceptions. The liberation of women seems to me as much a historical necessity as the abolition of slavery. Like abolition, a hopeless-looking cause before it actually triumphs. Even more momentous than abolition and its psychic and historical consequences. But anachronistic as their oppression may be, women will not be liberated without a hard struggle. A struggle that really does deserve the adjective revolutionary. This revolution must be both radical and conservative. It is conservative in the sense that it will reject the ideology of unlimited growth, ever-increasing levels of productivity and consumption, the unlimited cannibalization of the environment, an ideology shared with equal enthusiasm by the countries which call themselves capitalist and by those which aspire to communism. It is radical in the sense that it will challenge and remake the basically authoritarian moral habits common to both capitalist and communist countries. Liberating women is the most radical part of this new revolutionary process. In opposition to the whole accredited modern tradition about revolution, I am arguing that what used to be called the woman question not only exists, but exists independently of the issues generally posed by political radicals. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and Gramsci held that the oppression of women was not a separate problem, but rather one to be absorbed by the class struggle and eventually resolved by the creation of socialism. I do not agree. The fact is, no government which claims to operate on part of Marx's legacy has rethought the condition of women. On the contrary, every communist country has been content with offering women merely liberal improvements in their situations, like increased access to education and jobs and divorces, while preserving intact the overwhelming monopoly of political power by men, and leaving unchanged the structures of repression that characterize private relations between the two sexes. But the striking failure of all countries where left revolutionary governments have come to power to do anything radical for women should not be surprising. In none of the many edifying declarations made by the principal theorists of proletarian revolution in favor of emancipating women has the true complexity of the question ever been grasped. Marxists have not properly estimated the depth of sexism any more than, in setting out to defeat imperialism, they properly estimated the depths of racism. Now to the questions you do ask.